Hello, everybody. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting us, and we're happy to be here. My name is Jasmine Franklin. I am the director of Fly 5 programs with the Center for Responsive Schools, and we're here today to talk to you about learning loss and using SEL as a tool to combat learning loss. So I'm going to pass it over to one of our lead program developers, Angel, and we have our other lead program developer, Ali Cornicelli here. And we're going to all talk, we're going to pass it over to you now, Angel.
Thank you, Jasmine. Okay, so during today's session, we will focus on 3 objectives. So our first one is defining learning loss. Our second one, viewing learning loss through the lens of inequity. And our third objective, examining how SEL is a tool for learning loss recovery. As we define learning loss, keep in mind that this is a term that all educational stakeholders are familiar with. And this term will be discussed through the context or lens of the pandemic that we've all been dealing with, COVID-19. Learning loss has impacted teachers, students, and parents as they begin to plan and prepare for the upcoming school year or years to come. It is important that we consider what we already know about this term and how we can move forward to address it. So what exactly is learning loss? Learning loss applies to any time that a student has had an extended amount of time from learning. Usually learning loss takes place after students return from summer break. Currently, students are returning back to in-person learning from school closings due to the pandemic. So therefore, there might be a chance of a higher percentage of learning loss. Many studies have noted that this transition back into in-person learning might be a bit challenging for students and parents, and especially those students who are dealing with learning loss. As educators determine how to address this issue, they are considering the restructuring of schools and classrooms in the fall via virtual or hybrid instruction to help lessen this impact. According to McKinsey and Company, COVID-19 and learning loss report, they are stating that students who were already behind academically before COVID-19 are expected to have the most severe learning losses. Now that we have a greater insight and a better understanding of what to expect during the upcoming school year or school years, educators can begin to restructure their curriculum by putting practices into place that best supports their students and embraces some of the newly developed skills that students may have required throughout this pandemic.
All right. And so now that we've delved into what learning loss is and the impact of learning loss, and even thinking about the previous presenters talking about already thinking about looking ahead into the fall and already planning for making up for some of that loss throughout their school districts, we'll now look at learning loss with an extra lens of inequity. So take a moment to read this quote. So this is from one of the studies that we've used for our research for this presentation. And they have, seen that, of course, every county, every region, state to state have made different decisions on how to return, on when to return, on what model to use. And so we know that those decisions are made with the resources that those schools have. So in communities that are underserved, in communities where we have racial minorities, they may not have as many resources to choose from. And so the disparity has grown even wider. This is the one of the studies that Angel just mentioned, this McKinsey and Company. So this was one of the attempts to quantify the learning loss during the pandemic. There's been some brand new research that's just coming out now about how this learning loss, now that we're coming out of it, how it really looks in schools and in school communities. So one of the findings that they found is that they looked at 3 scenarios, 3 different reopenings and how those reopenings would take place. The worst case scenario is that 12 to 14 months of learning was lost. That's about 15 to 20% of the learning loss in those existing in the achievement gaps. And we know that those achievement gaps come from gaps in the opportunity in those different schools. So this report, among other reports from the pandemic and from learning loss, has prompted schools to, as we've been saying, take into consideration, okay, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to take on this challenge? And so as researchers estimate that about 2 months of learning were lost when looking through the lens of equity, we see that that loss is amplified in underserved communities. So the impacts of COVID-19 on Black communities have been more disruptive than on white communities. And the CDC states some really specific factors and why that is. One of them is just access to healthcare, limited access to these factors of lack of transportation or lack of childcare, inability to take time off work, maybe the historical and the current discrimination in our healthcare system. Another large factor is just general healthcare status. Underlying medical conditions have more of an impact on people in Black communities and it increases the risk for severe illness in COVID-19. And then also education, income, and wealth gaps. So inequities in access to high quality education leads to lower rates of college entrance, lower paying and less stable jobs, which do not often have paid sick leave and have associated shorter life expectancy and those higher risk factors. So all of these factors, all of these extra risk factors help us to see why the Black community has had more of an impact in COVID-19, leading to more learning loss for our racial and ethnic minority students. So as we think about learning loss for all of our students, when we look at it through this lens of inequity, we can start to see how we have some additional challenges to think about.
Okay, lastly, let's take a look at how SEL can be used as a support for learning loss recovery. Take a minute to read this slide. Students return to the classroom. We can look to social and emotional learning, SEL, to help students recover their academic gains. Research shows that the benefits of SEL includes improvement in students' social and emotional skills, attitudes, relationships with themselves and with others, academic performance, and perceptions of classroom and the school climate. Long-term improvements in students' skills, attitudes, pro-social behavior, and academic performance. Also, there is a decline in students' anxiety, behavior problems, and possibly substance abuse. To effectively address students' learning, we must work to support student success in all areas that are not just academics. Also with students when it comes to building SEL skills and development. So now let's consider the whole child. And with this being said, when thinking about learning loss, The loss to academic gains may be the first thought, but the loss to social and emotional development has an impact on the whole child. This means that using what we know about students' developmental needs to begin to consciously prioritize their social and emotional needs first, then addressing their academic needs, and then eventually blending both the SEL lens with the academic lens. We must first ask ourselves, how do we thoughtfully plan to support students developmentally, socially, and emotionally so that academic learning can effectively happen? The recommendations that we are suggesting are based on the research from An American Imperative, A New Vision of Public Schools, a report from the Learning 2025 National Commission on Student-Centered Equity Focused Education, published April of 2021. So as you all can tell, the impact of the learning loss due to the pandemic is a new study, but we are all familiar with that term learning loss as educators.
So the first recommendation is culture. So the whole learner is whole learner focused. The entire system must attend to the social, emotional, cognitive, the mental health, and the trauma-based needs of all learners. No learner is marginalized. That's also part of the recommendation, number one, culture. All children and families and staff must be embraced, valued equally, and served with equity, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic circumstance, or disability. And the third bullet must be future driven. Schools must routinely anticipate forthcoming changes in the career, social, economic, and technological landscapes to inform all decisions being made in the school system and in the school building. Recommendation number 2, the learning must be entirely student-centered. It must be around the learner. It must be student-focused. In order to meet all learners' social, emotional, and cognitive needs, instruction and learning must happen on a growth model continuum, where data and analytics, planning, learning, and evidence of learning operate in a feedback loop to personalize the learning. So the teachers must know the students that they're teaching, and then they must be constantly in a feedback loop, constantly assessing their students and personalizing the learning according to the students that they teach. And the third recommendation is resources. So panels of schools, associations, and federal leaders must convene to determine how to unlock resources to meet all children's whole learners, or meet all students as their whole learners, and meeting those needs. So here are the following categories for resources in order to help students to meet their whole learner needs. So learning accelerators. Broadband must be deemed as public utility so that all learners have access to the technologies necessary to access and accelerate learning. Aligned community resources. We need to, in order to meet the whole learner's needs, educators, learners, and learners' families must have access to a robust multi-tiered system of support. High quality early learning for all children. All children must engage in high quality, high impact early learning to prepare them to function as co-authors of their K-12 journey. And a diverse educator pipeline. Educators and staff, they should and must represent the learners and families and communities that they serve so that true culturally responsive learning is possible and is happening in the classroom consistently. So as I mentioned before, we're with the Center for Responsive Schools, and the Center for Responsive Schools is 40-year-old organization, and Responsive Classroom is one of our largest brands. We're now have been in development for a curriculum, a SEL curriculum called Fly 5 that contains a multitude of components. It's a full program suite that meets and aligns with the recommendations that we just mentioned here. So it's not limited to this, but this is the alignment for these specific components as a part of the Fly 5 curriculum. So inside of the curriculum, we have a mindfulness curriculum. It is a thread. It's called the Mindful Student, and it can be embedded into instruction to help students to identify and manage emotions and their emotional responses throughout the day. We also have our lessons. The way that our lessons are designed is meant for high flexibility so that you can see observable SEL skills. There's formative assessments inside of those lessons. Those lessons are 20 to 30-minute daily lessons that can be taught and flexed around the academic schedule. But for the Center for Responsive Schools, we believe that the social and emotional learning should be integrated with the academic curriculum, that it is as important as the academics. And so we wanted to make lessons that were highly functional and highly flexible so that educators can weave it throughout their day. And another part, when we talk about culture, recommendation number 1 is that our curriculum offers diverse and inclusive representation. So we had Fly 5 has a deep and intentional focus on diversity and representation. We designed Fly 5 with the awareness that diversity of students is not always reflected in the classroom. And so we wanted to create an educational product that represented the students, all students that are representative in our classroom. And so we have a cast of 9 characters that are featured throughout the curriculum that are from diverse ethnic backgrounds and race and cultures and have different family makeups so that children are able to connect and have relevant experiences with characters who look like them and with characters who don't, so that we can really hone in on their cognitive empathy. And the last part that is really important in order to combat learning loss and using SEL as a tool is to extend and reach out to the parents, reach out to the community of the students that you teach. Knowing them and knowing your parents as the expert or their guardians as the expert is as important to how you are teaching in the classroom. And having a bridge between school to home will be very impactful to help to combat against learning loss in students. And so as a part of that, we have a school to home connection toolkit that is meant for teachers and parents to have a connection for what is being taught in the classroom. And so that those same skills, SEL skills, are being taught at home. And so that parents are aware of what their students are learning, and we're able to have more of a partnership in their K-12 journey. So thank you for your time. Thank you again, Andrew, for having us. And this is just our contact information. If you want to learn more about learning loss, we have more information that we can give out. And you can visit our website at www.fly5sel.org to learn more about the curriculum.